Good morning. Title of the sermon, David and Goliath and Bathsheba and Nathan, a person after God's own heart. Last month on the 20th of June, that Sunday, we looked at the story of David and Goliath, among the best known Bible stories, period, bar none. And we looked at that story and we began with the traditional view of that story, which is like this. God miraculously provides all that is needed for David to overcome Goliath, overcome the incredible odds that are against him as he defeats Goliath. So that's like the traditional view. And to sort of, focus on the power of God. And to sort of get at the traditional view, we looked at a contemporary video that had gone viral of a 17-year-old girl in Southern California that comes out and there's something attacking her dog. She didn't actually see that it's a bear. She runs out and she pushes the bear off of this wall, and the bear kind of startled and it kind of runs away. And as sort of a contemporary David and Goliath, with her being like David against astronomical odds against this bear. The truth is, it was against astronomical odds. I mean, this is like a 1 out of 100. 99 out of 100 times she gets mauled badly or even killed by this bear. I mean, a bear claw is unbelievably destructive, but it's a fluke, right? And so that's kind of the traditional way we understand David and Goliath, right? Against astronomical odds, this outcome takes place. But then we looked at an alternative view, and it came out of the book called David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell, which is about underdogs and misfits and what can happen when people understand that they're an underdog, how they can reverse the odds. In the story, Malcolm Gladwell, who actually over the last 20 years is the best-selling writer in the world and has had bestseller after bestseller. This is his 5th book, but it's his first religious book. And he didn't really plan this to be a book at all, but he just got interested in this story, and he had never done biblical research before, but he really dug into the story to try to understand the story. Malcolm Gladwell's specialty is to try to understand things that shouldn't happen, like David and Goliath, right? So he studies that story. And he's surprised by what he finds. And the way he forms this alternative view, which we'll get to in a moment, is by focusing equally on the role that God plays, but also on the role that David plays in the story, which he feels is greatly underestimated. And that's why you end up with it being God. God is the one that does it all. And so he gets into research into things like slings. David uses a sling to kill Goliath, and he discovers that slings are these incredible weapons that 6 revolutions per second generates a projectile over 100 miles per hour, has the killing force of a bullet or even greater, and with practice, highly accurate at 15 to 20 feet, practically surefire at that range. And this is probably the range that David used in using the sling against Goliath. And so as he looks at it deeply, he discovers that, there's a little bit more to the story. Goliath is big, but he's slow. He's loud and he's arrogant. And he's probably not that young. He may be even in his 40s, and he might even be partially blind. All those things sort of come out of his research. David is small. I mean, he may be 15, 16 years old, but he's fast, and he's skilled. He's skilled with a sling. He's used this sling to kill bears and lions that attack the sheep because he works as a shepherd. And the key is David takes advantage of being underestimated. That's a huge part of the story. And the way that shows up is that David defines the fight. If Goliath had defined the fight, it would have been hand-to-hand combat, and Goliath would have annihilated David. But David pretends like it might be hand-to-hand combat, but when he gets in range, he takes him down with his sling. And what Gladwell says is that when you look at the whole story and put it all together, you realize that actually the odds really aren't against David. The odds are for David, that Goliath is the sitting duck. And so the traditional view, which Gladwell never felt comfortable with, this understanding of a God who just sort of does things against astronomical odds, this never really made sense to him. It's not the way he understood God at work. God miraculously provides all that is needed for David to overcome the incredible odds that are against him, and he defeats Goliath. Instead, what Gladwell discovers is that when you really do the research, there's a lot going on in the story. Goliath has strength, his size, his strength, his fame, his reputation, but he's got some weaknesses too. He's slow, he's overconfident, and he has this sense of invincibility or inevitability, that the outcome is guaranteed, which is a great weakness. That's right. David has weaknesses. He's not big. He doesn't have the strength of Goliath. He's got this vulnerability. And he's got this inexperience, right? But all of these he's able to turn into advantages because he knows that he's not going to fight Goliath on his terms. So he fights Goliath on his own terms, not on Goliath's terms, but his terms. He uses different weapons, and he creatively uses his gifts. And this happens through a God who works in and through David. He works through his physical body and the gifts that he has, through his mind, his thinking. He's smart, right? And it works through his spirit, his sense that God is with him, but God is with him through his body and his mind. So Gladwell says when you look deeper, it's a very different view than the traditional view. And here's sort of his conclusions from the book. God mostly works in and through us. Yeah, works through our body, mind, and spirit. Immense disadvantages humble us. And humility is incredibly powerful because it forces outside the box thinking. It forces creativity. Outside the box thinking results in a completely different approach to a problem. That's right. If David had applied simply Goliath's approach, he probably would have been annihilated. But instead, this different approach reverses the odds. And the impossible not only becomes possible, it actually becomes probable. What's amazing for Gladwell is that this biblical research that he does in turning into this book really affects him. And he had kind of distanced himself from his Christian faith, and this book was a game changer for him. It allowed him to see God in a way that made sense. And so in an interview after writing the book, he said this. He says, "We have difficulty seeing the power of God because we don't know where to look, and because we are overwhelmed by the immensity of the problem and the personal cost we might endure." But then he says, "But now I've seen the power of God, not only in the story of David, but that opens his eyes to seeing God at work often through people. But now I've seen the power of God, and I know how it works, and I will never be the same." Yeah. And so this Old Testament story, right? This epic story is like a devotional for Malcolm Gladwell, and it proves to be significantly transformational. So the story of David and Goliath can function in surprising ways. So we looked at that a month ago. Well, today we look at the other epic story of David, the story of David and Bathsheba and Nathan. And it's where Goliath is early on in David's life and career. It's in 1 Samuel, the first scroll of Samuel. The reason there's two Samuels, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, is it was too long to fit on one scroll. So the first scroll has the story of David and Goliath, and the second scroll, actually toward the end of David's life, maybe 40 years later, tells a very different story. So what I want to do is I want to look at this in a little bit different way. I want to look at this sort of devotionally And but before we enter into the story, and it's too long to read it all from the scriptures, and so I'm going to kind of share the story, and you can go and check it out. Make sure that what I'm saying fits in. But just take a look at David. So David, the biblical character of David, David means beloved, beloved by God. David lived about 1,000 years before Christ, and to appreciate what David does, to look at sort of our parallels for us as a country, you'd have to put together sort of George Washington, who was that military leader as well as being the first president. David was this military leader. Also, you have to look at someone like an Abraham Lincoln, who brings the nation together or holds the nation together, because David actually brings these 12 tribes of Israel together and unifies them as a nation. And you have to look at someone like Billy Graham, that David is an inspiration for a religious revival. He writes about half the Psalms are attributed to him, and he wrote actually a quarter of them himself. And he's the one that's sort of the worshiping life of Israel really starts to happen under him. So immensely influential in the history of Israel. You take David out of the equation, you don't have Jerusalem. He's the one who brings the capital to Jerusalem. Without David, you really don't have Israel coming together as a country. Without David, there is no Judaism, therefore. If there's no Israel as a country, there's no Judaism. If there's no Judaism, there's no Christianity. So David is this incredibly significant character. Now, the other thing about David is that there is this particular phrase that is used only about him, and it's used twice. And the phrase is this: a person after God's own heart. Yeah. It says something kind of about his heart, right? A person after God's own heart. David is this person after God's own heart. And you find that both in the Old Testament, in 1 Samuel, but you also find it in the New Testament, in a passage that's talking about Jesus. Yeah. And it talks about David being a person after God's own heart. And of course, Jesus is described as coming out of the line or the lineage of David. All right, so with that as a background, what I'd like to do is to look at the story devotionally. If the story of David and Goliath can function as a devotion for Malcolm Gladwell, this story may very well have that same power, but I think we need to look at it and be open to some surprises. Now, the first thing that's kind of important is to realize the story is found in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, but it's also found in Psalm 51, which is probably the second most famous psalm of David. The most famous being the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," and story of a shepherd, right? And Psalm 51 is a psalm that, we're going to look at it a little bit later. It was in our call to worship for this day as well. It's a pretty amazing psalm, especially when you look at the way it is described. So here we go. As we look at the story, it reads almost like a Shakespearean drama. In fact, some suggest that Shakespeare may have drawn upon this story in crafting his own dramas. That's how powerful and amazing this story is. All right, the story begins. It's a beautiful spring day. David, the king, is at the height of his power. He is enjoying a leisurely walk on the balcony of the palace in Jerusalem. From this vantage point, he can look over all Jerusalem. It is a joy to him to look out on what has grown into a great city because of his leadership. He is well past his youth. Some of his children are fully grown. In fact, he is ready to be a grandfather. David looks down from his balcony and sees a woman bathing. She's very beautiful. He begins to fantasize about her. Acting quickly before his conscience has a chance to stop him, he calls for his attendant to bring the woman to him. He discovers that her name is Bathsheba. She is married to a foreign soldier who is fighting for Israel. His name is Uriah. And at that very moment, he's off with Joab. David's top general in battle, to secure the border. David takes her to his room and seduces her. A few weeks later, Bathsheba sends words to David that she is pregnant. Suddenly, the secrecy of David's indiscretion is in jeopardy. But David comes up with a plan. He's got a plan. He orders Bathsheba's husband back from the front. So Uriah returns. David asks him, "How is the war going?" And then sends Uriah home to Bathsheba with the hope that Uriah will sleep with his wife, and this will explain her pregnancy. It's not a great plan, but it's the best David can come up with. However, Uriah feels it is dishonorable for him to be with his wife while his fellow soldiers are in battle. So Uriah doesn't sleep with Bathsheba. When plan A fails, David goes to plan B. He gets Uriah drunk with the hope that his honor will fade with his inebriation. Yet plan B fails too. So David comes up with an incredibly ruthless plan C. He sits down at his desk and he writes a letter to Joab, his general. And in the letter, he says, send Uriah to the front, and in the midst of intense fighting, have everyone else pull back so that he will be struck down. David then seals the letter with his personal wax seal. And then get this, he gives the letter to Uriah, his death sentence, of course Uriah doesn't know it, to deliver to Joab. David feels bad about what he is doing, but he feels he has no choice. For David is not only the military leader of the people of Israel and the political leader of the people of Israel, believe it or not, he is also the spiritual leader of the people of Israel. And rumor of this affair would sully his spiritual leader credibility. Well, plan C works like clockwork. Uriah is killed, and after the appropriate and acceptable amount of time for Bathsheba to properly grieve the death of her husband, David sends for her, taking her as his wife. Of course, word would have spread, probably by David's own palace advisors, that the king was showing great compassion and empathy for the widow of a fallen soldier of Israel. A number of months later, Nathan the prophet comes to see David, comes to see the king. Nathan as a prophet was sort of like a priest or a pastor to the king, but also the spiritual advisor who was to speak on behalf of God and God's justice. Now, when Nathan comes to speak with David, he's very nervous. By his demeanor, something is obviously wrong. David asks Nathan, "What's the problem?" Nathan tells him about a rich man who has great flocks of sheep, and a poor man that has but one little lamb, which he loves. It's everything he has in the world. Well, one day an important traveler comes to visit the rich man. Nathan says the rich man wanted to have a great dinner to honor the important guest. And even though he has great flocks, he had his servants go and take the poor man's lamb, which was butchered and consumed by the rich man at this great feast. When David hears Nathan tell him this righteous indignation burns within David. How could a soul be so dark? How could this rich man use his power so unjustly? Such arrogance. David exclaims, that rich man deserves to die for what he did. David waited for Nathan's affirmation. Of course, Nathan would agree with David. Nathan was an honorable prophet, a person of integrity. Yet Nathan doesn't immediately respond. Why wasn't he providing the affirmation of David's just verdict? Nathan, however, is sweating profusely. He appears more nervous than David had ever seen him before. He swallows and then looks David in the eye and says, "You, my king, are the rich man. You are the man. You took Uriah's wife, which was wrong, and then you covered it up, ultimately having Uriah killed to cover up for your indiscretion. David's first sense was plan D. In fact, plan D was even easier than plan A, B, and C. All he had to do was order Nathan's immediate execution. David hated to do it. He kind of liked Nathan, but he had no choice. Unfaithful, heretical prophets were killed with great regularity. People wouldn't bat an eye. David would simply proclaim that Nathan had blasphemed against God, and David the king and spiritual leader was avenging God's honor. Yet in his consciousness, on his way to justify plan D, an image comes to David's mind, an old image. It's the image of old Goliath. Unquestionably, this powerful warrior, a loud and arrogant image, the image of a bully who has incredible power and uses his great power to intimidate anyone who would dare to take him on. Goliath was so sure of his invincibility that he was completely believed his own hubris. He was practically like a god. This little shepherd boy, this child, was nothing. He would be annihilated. What was this image about that came to him as he stood before Nathan? At first glance, Nathan was this seemingly powerless prophet. Yet what Nathan had pulled from his pouch and creatively slung at David was not aimed at David's head. David's cruel and calculating head was invulnerable to the projectile that Nathan had slung. David's ruthlessness of thought had become amazingly powerful. He believed his own hubris. However, David suddenly realizes that Nathan has aimed not for his head, but for his heart. And Nathan, like David had been 40 years earlier, was dead on in his accuracy, hitting the target of David's heart. David realizes that he, like Goliath, has become an arrogant bully who believes his own crazy hubris, his own justifications. David wonders in that moment, what sort of monster have I become? Who am I? This is my life. This is my faith. Suddenly, David imagines himself standing before not a mere mortal, but standing before God. There is no hiding from God. There is no hiding from the truth. Then something totally unexpected happened within David. As he confronts his own darkness, looking not through the eyes of his head, but through the eyes of his heart, a hope emerges. The hope of coming clean. The hope of offering to God his brokenness, his own broken heart, the target of Nathan's projectile, to simply come clean and acknowledge not only that own initial indiscretion with Bathsheba, but the chain of ruthless acts he had committed to cover up that indiscretion. Paradoxically, what is impossible for him to get his head around is more than possible for his heart to yearn for. So David, speaking through his heart, cries out, I have sinned against the Lord. I have sinned against you, Lord. I have failed you. As David confesses his sin, as he confesses his arrogance, as he confesses his abuse of power, as he confesses his murder, there is this incredible inner confirmation, an epiphanal movement of the Spirit of God that confirms his heart-led decision. Yes, there would be consequences for his sinfulness. In fact, his adultery with Bathsheba and ruthless cover-up would become the source of countless future Shakespearean dramas. He would become the legendary embodiment of human weakness. He would forever be known for his moral weakness, perhaps as much as he is known for his bravery and his shrewdness as a warrior. Yet in that moment, the heart light that pierced even the darkness of human pride and arrogance came from a heart that was capable of contrition, a bruisable heart, a heart that had become unhardened. David realized that he truly did have a choice of going with his ruthless head or his contrite and bruisable heart. And that heart that burned bright in that moment would become the embodiment of his eternal epitaph. More than the slayer of Goliath, more than the military genius who unified Israel into a nation, more than the writer of Psalms that would initiate Israel into a worshiping people. More than any of that, David's epitaph would be this: a person after God's own heart. No other person in the Bible is given that elevated affirmation from God. Not Abraham, not Moses, not Elijah. It is uniquely bestowed upon David, and not once, but twice. Once in the Old Testament and once again in the New Testament, in a passage that tells of the lineage God chooses to go through, the lineage of David, to reveal the incarnational chosen one of God. Not too bad for a person who comes a hairbreadth from being a second Goliath. Amen. What I'd like to do is move right into our the 51st Psalm, which was in our call to worship, but we're going to return to it. One of the amazing things about the 51st Psalm, if you're reading in your Bible and you come to the 51st Psalm, it says these words, a Psalm of David. When the prophet Nathan came to David after he had gone into Bathsheba, you almost have to get the PG version of that when kids ask, what does that mean to go into Bathsheba? That's right. It's very out there. That's right. It's an amazing psalm. It's a confession. And we're going to pray it together. So I would invite you to join with me as we did in our call to worship, but now knowing a little more of the full story, knowing a little bit more of David being a person after God's own heart. So join with me. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain in me a willing spirit. Deliver me from bloodshed, O God of my salvation, for you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to you, O God, is a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Amen.